settle in, and let yourself grow heavy. There's nowhere to be now, nothing to do but rest. Let your mind wander to the quiet depths where Jung's wise old man waits in shadow. If this quiets your mind, subscribe, and there's always another waiting tomorrow night. In the autumn of 1900, a young man arrived at the Berghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, carrying a single suitcase and a book he had not yet finished reading. He was 25 years old. The hospital sat on a hill above the city, its long stone corridors smelling of carbolic and old wood, and the man who carried the suitcase had chosen this place deliberately, passing over more prestigious appointments, because he had read enough of the book in his bag to believe that the human mind was stranger and more layered than anyone in medicine was yet prepared to admit. The book was Sigmund Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, published the year before, in 1899, though its publisher had dated it 1900 as if to signal that the work belonged to the century just beginning, rather than the one just closed. Carl Gustav Jung had read the first pages on the train and had already marked the margins in his small, careful hand. The Berghölzli was directed at that time by Eugen Bleuler, a psychiatrist who believed in taking his patients seriously, in listening to them as though what they said about their inner lives was evidence rather than symptom. Jung had found the right place. He moved into the hospital building, as was required of junior staff, and in the evenings after his ward rounds, he returned to Freud's book. What he found there was not a system of thought he adopted wholesale. Jung was never a man who adopted anything wholesale, but a conviction he recognized, the conviction that beneath the surface of what a person consciously thought and felt, something else was operating, something that followed its own logic and its own purposes, and that communicated, when it communicated at all, in the compressed and oblique language of dreams. He read slowly. He put the book down and returned to it. After enough of that returning, something in his understanding of his patients began to shift. Those first years at the Berghölzli were years of observation. Jung worked on the wards, listened to the psychotic patients whose speech had broken loose from ordinary logic and floated in strange mythological waters, and began to suspect that what sounded like incoherence from outside might have a structure from within. He developed a word association test, measuring not only what words a patient produced in response to stimulus words, but how long it took them to respond, noticing that hesitation clustered around particular themes, around particular emotional territories that the patient was not consciously guarding, but that the psyche seemed to be protecting on its own. He called these clusters complexes, emotionally charged knots of association organized around a core feeling tone, functioning autonomously beneath the threshold of awareness. The word would enter the general language. Jung was 26 when he began this work. He was not yet in correspondence with Freud. The letter, when it came, arrived in 1906. Jung had sent Freud a copy of his studies on word association, and Freud had written back with the controlled warmth of a man who recognizes in another person's work an extension of his own. What followed was an exchange of letters that grew longer and more frequent over the months that followed, each man reading in the other's work something that confirmed and enlarged his own thinking, each man finding in the correspondence a quality of intellectual companionship that neither, it seems, had expected to find with such completeness. By 1907, Jung had traveled to Vienna to meet Freud in person. By all accounts, they talked for 13 hours on the first day, stopping only because night had made further conversation impractical. Freud was 50. Jung was 31. The difference in age was part of what made the relationship extraordinary, and part of what would eventually make it impossible to sustain. The year 1909 brought both men together on a ship crossing the Atlantic, invited to lecture at Clark University in Massachusetts. They spent the days of the crossing analyzing each other's dreams, which was at that period the most intimate form of intellectual collaboration either of them practiced. Each man lay on the deck or in his cabin and offered up the previous night's images for examination, and each man interpreted what the other had brought. It was a generous and unusual arrangement, and it contained, in that generosity, the seeds of what would not survive. In Freud's dreams, and in his responses to Jung's interpretations, Jung began to notice a pattern, a recurring guardedness around certain material, a deflection at particular points, as if the theory itself were being protected from what the dream was trying to show. And in Jung's dreams, Freud found something that troubled him for different reasons, imagery that seemed to him to reach beyond the personal history of the dreamer into territory that the theory of libido, as he had constructed it, could not fully accommodate. Neither man named what was happening. The ship continued west. The lectures were given. Both men were honored, and the incompatibilities that their crossing together had quietly disclosed continued to develop beneath the surface of the continuing correspondence for 3 more years. What Jung was finding in his clinical work and in his own thinking was that the psychic energy Freud had named libido could not, in his observation, be confined to its sexual origins without doing violence to the evidence. He watched it move through patients in whom sexuality was simply not the organizing principle of the disturbance. He watched it flow into religious devotion, into artistic creation, into the elaboration of symbolic systems that had no obvious erotic content and yet carried an intensity, a heat, that the word libido, energy, drive, appetite seemed exactly right to describe. The question was not whether Freud's concept was useful. It was whether the concept was large enough to hold what Jung was seeing. He concluded, slowly, and with the full awareness of what the conclusion would cost, that it was not. In 1912, he published Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, translated later as Symbols of Transformation, a work in which he traced the mythological imagination of an American woman named Miss Frank Miller through the entire range of comparative mythology, arguing that the symbols she produced in her visions and fantasies were not disguised expressions of repressed sexuality, but manifestations of a libido that was essentially creative, that moved through mythological and spiritual channels with the same force and the same legitimacy it moved through biological ones. The book read ancient Egyptian texts alongside Norse sagas. It placed the images of a woman in early 20th century North America beside the cosmological narratives of the ancient world and found them speaking to each other in ways that the personal history of any individual could not account for. Freud read the manuscript before publication. He understood what it meant. Jung understood that he understood. The correspondence between them did not immediately cease, but the quality of what passed between them changed, and by 1913 the formal break had arrived. No single letter carried the rupture. It assembled itself gradually from the weight of what each man could no longer say to the other with the expectation of being met. They had built something together, a friendship, a theoretical alliance, a shared project of taking the unconscious seriously as a field of scientific inquiry, and the building had been real. What it could not survive was the divergence of what each man fundamentally believed about the nature of the psyche and the source of its energy. After the break, Jung continued to see patients, continued to practice, But something had shifted in the territory beneath his professional life. He began to notice that when he returned home from the clinic each evening, the questions he was holding did not let him go. He would sit in his study in the house at Kusnacht, on the edge of Lake Zurich, with the water visible through the windows when the light was right, and he would find that what he had always used to stabilize himself, reading, writing, the orderly prosecution of theoretical work, had ceased to do what it had always done. Something in the ground beneath him was in motion. He made a decision that was, by any ordinary measure, unusual for a trained physician and a working psychiatrist. Rather than managing what was arising in him through the available professional means, analysis, consultation with colleagues, the clinical distance that the training provided, he chose to sit with it directly. He chose to watch. The practice he developed in those years at Kusnacht, sitting alone in the evenings or in the early mornings, allowing the interior images to arise and holding them in sustained attention rather than explaining them away, was not at first a method. It was a form of patience. It was the kind of attention a naturalist might bring to a landscape that has not yet been catalogued, the patience of watching without yet knowing what one is watching for. They were sometimes grandiose, sometimes desolate, sometimes so archaic in their imagery that Jung could not find them in any text he had read, though he had by that point read a very great deal. He wrote them down, he drew them, he tried carefully to treat them as data rather than as symptoms, as communications rather than as breakdowns. Whether he always succeeded in this is a question the record cannot fully answer. What the record shows is that he kept the practice going, and that the practice over time began to produce something. In the evenings, after his clinical day was done, he began to write in a large notebook, and eventually to transfer what he wrote into a large leather-bound folio volume, working in a formal calligraphic script and illustrating the pages with images he painted himself. The volume was enormous, almost medieval in its ambition. Its pages combined narrative, dialogue, poetry, and illuminated imagery of extraordinary visual density. He worked on it for 17 years, between 1913 and 1930, and he showed it to almost no one. He never published it in his lifetime. It sat in a bank vault after his death, in the keeping of his family, for decades, and the world did not encounter it in full until 2009, when it was published as the Asterisk Red Book. Asterisk, or by its Latin title, Asterisk Liber Novus Asterisk. What the Asterisk Red Book, Asterisk Records is, among many things, Jung's encounter with a figure he called Philemon. The encounter did not arrive as an ordinary thought, or as a piece of creative invention that Jung recognized as his own. It arrived as a waking vision, and Jung, trained as he was in the clinical evaluation of such states, paid careful attention to that distinction. He was not asleep. He was not in a psychotic episode, in any sense that his clinical training would have recognized. He was in a state of receptive inner attention, watching the interior space with the patience he had been developing when the figure appeared to him, an old man moving across water with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull, holding a bunch of 4 keys and carrying something of the atmosphere of the ancient world, Egyptian perhaps, or Gnostic, belonging to no single tradition, but carrying the feeling of extreme age. The figure spoke, and this is the detail that Jung returned to in his later writings, with a consistency that suggests it struck him as genuinely significant, not as an illustration, but as a fact. What Philemon said did not feel to Jung as though it had originated with himself. He described it carefully, not as hallucination, not as imagination in the ordinary sense, but as an encounter with an autonomous psychic presence, something that seemed to know things independently of what Jung consciously knew, and to have a perspective that was not simply a reflection or a reorganization of his own. He wrote down what Philemon said. He made paintings of the figure. He walked in the garden at Küsnacht in the evenings and felt. He later wrote that Philemon walked beside him, that the conversations continued outside the formal sessions of interior attention, that the presence had a consistency and an independence that made simple psychological explanation feel inadequate. Jung was clear in his later theoretical work that he did not mean this in a literal metaphysical sense. He was not claiming that an external spirit had entered his life. What he was claiming was that the psyche contained figures whose autonomy, whose apparent independence from the ego's intentions and knowledge demanded a different kind of understanding than the one that simply reduced them to projections of the dreamer's own material. Philemon represented something in the psyche that was not simply Jung. It was older than Jung. It knew more, or differently, than Jung's conscious mind had access to. And it came, characteristically, when the ordinary resources of the ego had been exhausted. He did not yet have the theoretical vocabulary to say precisely what this was. That vocabulary would come later, built slowly from the clinical evidence and the comparative mythology and the long engagement with alchemical texts that would occupy decades of subsequent work. In those early years at the desk in Küsnacht, with the painted pages of the asterisk red book, asterisk drying in the lamplight, what he had was only the experience itself, the encounter, the conversation, the strange quality of being addressed by something within himself that felt unmistakably like not himself. The analytical psychology that Jung would spend the rest of his long career elaborating was not, in his own understanding, a system he invented. It was, in a more unusual sense, a system he discovered, or rather, a system that disclosed itself to him through the experience of sitting quietly with what the psyche produced, when the ego's ordinary management was temporarily suspended. The great theoretical structures, the distinction between the personal and the collective unconscious, the concept of the archetype, the individuation process, the typology, all of these would come, but they would come as attempts to account for something that had already happened, to find language adequate to experience that preceded the language and exceeded it. In that sense, the asterisk red book, asterisk is not the place where the theories were developed. It is the place where the evidence was accumulated. It is 17 years of observation conducted with the discipline of a scientist and the receptivity of an artist, of a mind watching its own depths, with the patience of someone who has accepted that what lives in those depths does not arrive on schedule and cannot be compelled. The house at Küsnacht stood beside the lake. The lamp in the study burned late. The large folio volume accumulated its pages, calligraphic text, painted imagery, the elaborate visual records of encounters that had no ordinary name, and somewhere within those pages, in a dialogue, recorded and re-recorded across many sessions of interior attention, the old man with the kingfisher's wings appeared and spoke and walked and did not explain himself, but offered, in the quality of his presence, something that the young psychiatrist, no longer quite so young, by then had not been able to find in any of the available theoretical frameworks. Jung's psyche, as he would later theorize, was doing what he believed the psyche always does, compensating. When the ego has run out of what it knows, when the road forward has narrowed to a path that the conscious personality cannot see clearly enough to walk, something else arises. Not always, not for everyone, not in the same form, but the tendency, the capacity, The structural possibility was there in the psyche, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to manifest. And one of the conditions Jung would find over decades of clinical observation was precisely the kind of exhaustion, the kind of genuine not knowing that follows the collapse of what one had previously relied upon. And the break with Freud had been, among many things, a collapse of what Jung had relied upon: the theoretical certainty of a shared project, the intellectual companionship, the sense of standing within an established framework with a man whose authority he had genuinely respected. All of this had gone. What remained was the question, which had always been the real thing anyway, and which the framework had been both illuminating and in certain ways limiting. He had been asking in his own manner what the mind actually was, not what it appeared to be from outside, and not what it reported about itself when asked directly, but what it was when met in the conditions that strip away the ordinary management, in dreams, in visions, in the extremity of breakdown, in the long silence of a late evening with no one else in the room, and no argument to maintain, and no position to defend. He had been asking this question with a rigor and an openness that his training had given him the tools for, and that his own nature had given him the temperament for. And the answer that was arriving, slowly and in pieces, through the figure of Philemon and through the other figures that populated the asterisk Red Book's pages, was stranger and more interesting than anything the available frameworks had predicted. Some part of the mind, it seemed, was not under the mind's management. Some part generated figures and landscapes and voices that arrived with the authority of genuine otherness, that knew things the ego did not know, and said things the ego would not have said. Some part was, in a word, that Jung would use carefully and with full awareness of its difficulty, autonomous. What that meant, philosophically, clinically, personally, would take the rest of his life to work out. He lived to be 85. He spent those decades building a body of work that reached from clinical psychology into comparative mythology, alchemical symbolism, Eastern philosophy, and the borders of physics, always circling back to the central question that the asterisk Red Book, asterisk years, had posed, and that no single theoretical answer had ever quite resolved. But the question was first posed in the evenings at Kusnacht, in the years when the pages were being painted, and the lamp was burning low, and the figure of an old man was walking in the garden beside a lake in Switzerland, speaking in sentences that the man who heard them could not account for as his own. The lamp is still lit in those pages. The garden is still there, in the record that Jung left of what he found when he stopped managing his own depths and simply watched. And the figure, old, winged, unhurried, carrying its 4 keys, is still walking at the edge of the image, in the light that falls from the window of a house where a man once sat alone with the full weight of what he did not know, and decided, with something that must have felt very much like courage and very much like surrender, to write it down, what it means when the mind encounters something within itself that feels genuinely wiser than itself, when the interior produces a voice that seems to arrive from beyond the interior, a figure that knows more than the figure who imagines it. This is a question that the painted pages of the asterisk Red Book asterisk do not answer. They hold it, instead, in the amber of their illuminated imagery, in the careful calligraphy of a man sitting alone in a lamplit room with the lake cold and dark outside and the house quiet around him, asking a question he could not yet name, listening for the answer with the full, unhurried attention of someone who has understood, finally, that whatever it is that lives in the depths of the mind, it cannot be rushed and it cannot be forced, and it has been there far longer than any of the frameworks built to contain it. The lamp burns, the pages wait, the question hangs in the air of the quiet room, open and unhurried, as all the most honest questions do. Jung was at his desk in the early 1920s, the lamp already lit, though the afternoon had not yet fully gone, surrounded by volumes stacked in no particular order, Sanskrit commentaries, Norse mythological texts, a German translation of the Rig Veda, a French edition of Egyptian mortuary literature, and the handwritten notes he had been accumulating for years on what he was beginning to call, carefully and without haste, the collective dimension of the psyche. He had been working on the manuscript that would become asterisk psychological types, asterisk, a long and demanding book, more a survey of the landscape of human inner life than an argument toward a single conclusion. With some frozen somewhere in the middle of a page, and he was reading a passage in the Rig Veda that described a figure appearing to a seeker in the hours before dawn, an ancient presence, formless but directing, speaking from a depth that the text insisted was not personal to any individual but shared, somehow across all those who had ever looked inward with sufficient patience and honesty. He had read something like this in a patient's notes the day before. Not the same words, not even the same imagery, precisely, but the same shape, the same structure of encounter, the same figure arriving from a depth that the patient herself had not created and could not account for. He sat with that for a moment, the pen still. Outside, the lake was darkening. The comparison seemed to mean something, though what it meant he could not yet say cleanly. The question he was sitting with was one of the oldest questions depth psychology had found itself returning to, almost against its will. When the mind produces images, in dreams, in states of illness, in moments of extreme exhaustion or intensity, where exactly do those images come from? They do not come, it seemed increasingly clear to Jung, entirely from the individual life. They carry details that the individual life has not supplied. They follow patterns that have been following human beings since before any particular human being was alive to be followed. That question opened, under examination, into a much larger one. It opened into the question of whether the individual human mind is built, from the very beginning, on something it did not build. The distinction Jung was working toward in those years was a careful one, and it mattered enough to him that he kept returning to it, refining it, resisting the simpler formulations that would have made it easier to say, but less true. On one side of the distinction was what he would call the personal unconscious. This was familiar ground, mapped already in broad terms by the tradition he had come from, the layer of the mind below conscious awareness that contained the forgotten, the repressed, the half-processed residue of an individual life, dreams that revisit old anxieties, reactions that belong to a childhood no longer consciously remembered, impulses whose origins are biographical, traceable in principle to particular events, particular relationships, particular moments when something was learned or suppressed or set aside. This layer was real. Its contents were genuinely unconscious, genuinely influential, genuinely available for exploration, given sufficient time and honesty. Jung did not dispute any of that. It was the foundation on which everything else he thought had been built. But beneath it, and this was the move that changed the shape of everything, beneath it was something else, something that was not personal, something that was not derived from any individual experience, and could not, in principle, be derived from one, a layer of the mind that was shared not in the way a cultural tradition is shared, passed from teacher to student, from parent to child, from text to reader, but shared in the way that the architecture of the hand is shared, inherited structurally, carried in the very organization of the organism, present before experience has had any opportunity to deposit its contents. This was the collective unconscious. The name Jung eventually settled on after several years of working around the edges of the concept. It was a transpersonal substrate, a layer of the psyche that no single life had generated and no single life could exhaust. It was not a memory bank of shared cultural images. It was not a mystical realm existing independently of individual minds. It was, in Jung's most careful formulation, a set of inherited formal tendencies, structural predispositions, built into the human mind through the long process of its evolution that organized psychic experience around the situations that had been most universally and persistently human. The word he used for the contents of this layer was one he borrowed and transformed from several earlier uses, archetypes. And the care he took with that word, the number of times he returned to clarify what he did and did not mean by it, is itself a measure of how precisely he believed the distinction needed to be held. An archetype, in Jung's use, is not an inherited image. This was the misreading he spent a great deal of effort correcting, because it was the most natural misreading, and because it collapsed the distinction on which everything else depended. If archetypes were inherited images, specific pictures or stories or characters carried genetically from one generation to the next, they would be rigid, culturally specific, and empirically testable in ways that turned out not to match the evidence. A Chinese farmer and a Norwegian sailor and an Ashanti elder would have to be producing the same dream images in the same visual form, and they were not. What they inherited was not the image, but the capacity to produce certain kinds of images in response to certain kinds of situations. The predisposition, the formal tendency, the channel, not the water flowing through it. Jung offered an analogy from biology. The human infant does not inherit a specific mother. It inherits a mother-shaped readiness, an anticipatory structure in the psyche that will organize itself around whatever maternal presence it encounters. The actual mother, particular, imperfect, historically specific, will fill a pattern that preceded her. The archetype is the pattern. The specific human figure who activates it is what Jung called the archetypal image, and the two are not the same thing, and confusing them leads in directions that the psychology cannot follow without losing its footing. This is a distinction worth holding for a moment, because it carries a great deal of the weight of what follows. The torque type itself, the formal predisposition, is not directly accessible to consciousness. It is not a thing that can be seen or described in itself. What becomes visible, what enters dreams and visions and myths and paintings, is always the archetypal image, the culturally and personally inflected expression of the underlying pattern. The pattern itself remains, as Jung sometimes put it, beyond direct representation. In the early 1920s, working through those stacked volumes of comparative mythology and religious text, Jung was assembling the evidential case for the collective unconscious. The method he used he called amplification, and it was a method built on a specific kind of comparative attention. He was not looking for proof that all cultures had borrowed from one another. That argument was available and had been made, and it was not what interested him. He was looking for something more difficult to explain, the structural coincidences that appeared across cultures and traditions with no historical contact, no plausible pathway by which the image or story or symbolic pattern could have traveled from one to another. The dying and rising God, the world tree at the center of the cosmos, its roots in the underworld, and its canopy in the heavens, the great flood from which a remnant of humanity is preserved to begin the world again, the figure of the wise supernatural guide who appears to the traveler at the moment of greatest need, asking a question or offering a tool, or pointing toward a path that the traveler could not have found alone. These structures appeared in ancient Egyptian texts and in Norse sagas, and in the oral traditions of Pacific Island peoples, and in the dream journals of patients in Zurich who had never read any of them. They appeared not as borrowed decoration, but as spontaneous productions, as images the psyche generated from its own resources, under sufficient pressure or in sufficient depth, without having been taught to generate them. The researcher who spread those manuscripts across a table, the illuminated Egyptian papyrus beside the Norse asterisk, Edda asterisk, the Navajo sand painting beside the medieval alchemical diagram, and found at the center of each a circular image of similar structure, with a center point and a radial symmetry and a sense of completeness that the surrounding imagery supported rather than generated, was not finding proof of cultural diffusion. The dates did not support it. The geographies did not support it. What they were finding, if Jung's argument held, was a formal tendency in the human mind to organize its deepest experience around circular wholeness, a tendency that expressed itself differently in each tradition, but consistently in structure, because the structure was built into the mind itself. This was not a mystical argument, however much it sounded like one. Jung was insistent about this, sometimes to the point of impatience. He was reaching for a biological grounding, not a metaphysical one. Just as the anatomy of the human shoulder carries the long evolutionary history of the vertebrate limb, just as the structure of the eye carries within it the accumulated optical solutions of millions of years of visual organisms, the human psyche carries formal patterns shaped by the long history of what it is meant to be human, and before that, to be the kind of creature that eventually became human, the universally recurring situations, birth and death, the helplessness of the infant, the power of the nurturing other, the terror of the dark, the necessity of separation from what formed us, the encounter with something vastly larger than the self, the experience of being lost, and the experience of finding a guide. These were not the property of any particular culture. They were the shared furniture of the human situation, and over millions of repetitions of those situations, the mind had developed structural responses to them, inherited formal tendencies that arose in each new life to meet them. The archetype, in this sense, was older than any individual, older than any culture, older in a meaningful sense than language itself, since the formal patterns it expressed appeared in pre-linguistic experience, in the organization of the body's first responses to its environment, in the structure of the earliest dream. In the early 1920s, Jung was sitting with a patient, a woman, middle-aged, who had been working with him for some months, who had brought to the session a dream involving an underground river. She had dreamed it before, in different forms, always the river, always underground, always moving in a direction she could not follow but could hear. She had her own associations to it, memories of a particular landscape from childhood, a feeling she connected to her mother, a recurrent sense of something unfinished. These were real, and they mattered, and Jung listened to them carefully. But as she spoke, Jung found his attention moving in another direction, not toward her personal history, but toward the images themselves, their structure, their consistency across cultures, he had been reading about for years. Underground rivers appeared in Greek mythology as the rivers of the underworld, carrying souls between lives. They appeared in the shamanistic traditions of the far north as the pathways by which the shaman descended to the lower world. They appeared in alchemical texts as the hidden solvent running beneath the visible earth, the asterisk aqua permanens, asterisk that dissolved and renewed. The woman had no knowledge of any of this. She had simply dreamed. when Jung offered not an interpretation from her biography, but a context from the long human record of that same image, something shifted in her face, not recognition of information she had known and forgotten, but recognition of something more like weight. The dream felt suddenly more serious than she had known how to make it, not more personal, more ancient, as if the image she had been carrying had roots far deeper than her own life, and she had just been shown the depth of the soil it was growing from. This was what constellated meant in Jung's vocabulary. When the inherited formal pattern was activated, brought into contact with a sufficiently resonant lived situation, it did not simply produce an intellectual recognition. It generated something more like a weather system, intensity of feeling that seemed disproportionate to the occasion, dreams of sudden vividness and authority, inexplicable attractions or repulsions, a sense that something larger than ordinary life had become briefly visible at the surface of experience. The archetype, when constellated, was not a theory. It was a living force, pressing, specific, carrying its own agenda. The person experiencing it did not feel as though they were illustrating a psychological concept. They felt as though something that mattered enormously had arrived and was waiting to be acknowledged. The intellectual framework came later, if it came at all. The experience itself came first, unbidden, with the authority of something that did not require permission. Jung returned to this distinction often because it mattered enormously to the way the psychology worked in practice. The archetype was not a category into which experiences were sorted. It was a source from which experiences arose. The category came after, the naming, the placing within a framework, the scholarly apparatus of comparative mythology that Jung spent decades building, but the arising itself was primary, and no amount of theoretical architecture could replicate it or substitute for it. The collective unconscious, understood in this way, was not a storehouse. It was something more like a generative field, a dimension of the psyche from which specific images and figures and patterns could emerge, given the right conditions, carrying the full weight of the long human record of similar emergences. Each instance was particular, this dreamer, this image, this specific combination of personal history and archetypal pressure, but each instance was also simultaneously connected to every other instance of the same underlying pattern, wherever and whenever it had arisen in the long human history. The difficulty of holding both of those things at once, the particularity and the universality, the personal and the transpersonal, was, Jung believed, one of the central difficulties of depth psychology and one of its most distinctive contributions to the broader question of what a human life is. The individual was not simply an instance of a universal type, but the individual was also not sealed off from the vast transpersonal inheritance that the psyche carried. Both were true, fully and simultaneously, and the work of psychological understanding required moving between them without collapsing one into the other. The anthropologist who sat in the Pacific Islands in the early years of the 20th century, working slowly through the grammar of an oral tradition with the help of an elder who trusted her enough to share what had not been shared with outsiders before, was transcribing a creation myth. The myth had its local features, particular animals, particular landscapes, a set of ancestral figures specific to that tradition, but embedded within it, structural to the narrative, in a way that the local features only clothed rather than constituted, was a sequence, the darkness before the world, a sound, or a movement within the darkness, a separation of what had been unified, a figure or a force that stood at the boundary between the old order and the new, a teaching given at the moment of greatest disorientation, a world that could not have been reached without the disorientation that preceded it. A Viennese analyst had recorded something with that same sequence the previous week from a patient's dream in a clinical notebook that the anthropologist would never read. The sequence was not borrowed, it was not remembered. It had not traveled from one tradition to another along any traceable route. It was there because, in some sense, that the available conceptual vocabulary kept straining to contain. It had always been there, built into the structure of minds that had been asking in every language and in every landscape the same fundamental questions about darkness and light and what stands at the boundary between them. Some patterns in the human mind are older than the cultures that express them. This was the sentence Jung kept arriving at, in different forms, across the different manuscripts and lectures and clinical notes of those years. He was not entirely comfortable with all of its implications, and said so more than once. The boundary between a transpersonal psychic inheritance and a metaphysical claim about the structure of reality was not a boundary he was always confident about holding. He was a scientist by training, committed to empirical grounding, resistant to the kinds of spiritualist interpretation that the collective unconscious easily attracted. He wanted to be describing what the mind did, not what the cosmos was. But the evidence kept pressing. The same circular image at the center of the Egyptian papyrus and the Navajo sand painting, the same wise figure appearing at the moment of threshold in the grim fairy tale and in the patient's dream and in the Vedic text, the same underground river, the same dying and rising, the same moment when the ordinary resources of the personality are exhausted and something arrives from a depth that the personality did not create to offer what the personality alone could not find. Jung's analogy to evolutionary biology was doing genuine work in his argument, not merely providing a respectable scientific frame. The point of the analogy was that inherited structure is not mystical. It is the accumulated result of a very long history of solutions to recurring problems. The shoulder carries the evolutionary history of the vertebrate limb, not because of any cosmic plan, but because the organisms that had good shoulders survived long enough to pass the shoulder on. The psyche carried its inherited formal patterns, not because of any metaphysical necessity, but because the minds that had those patterns, that organized their experience around certain structures, that activated certain responses in certain situations, navigated the human world more successfully across millions of repetitions of the same fundamental situations than the minds that did not. In this reading, the collective unconscious was neither mystical nor supernatural. It was the most natural thing in the world. It was what the mind looked like after an enormously long time of being the kind of mind that had to face birth and death and darkness and the need for guidance and the loss of what had formed it and the discovery that something could survive that loss. The archetypes were the formal residue of all of that, the patterns that the long human experience had worn into the structure of the mind, the way a river wears a channel into stone, not imposed from outside, but carved from inside by the repeated pressure of the same conditions. There was a developmental moment, not remembered, because it happened before memory had the necessary structure to retain it, but present in the record of observation of infants across cultures, when the mother imago first organized itself around the actual mother, when the inherited formal tendency to recognize and respond to the nurturing other encountered its first specific human face. The archetype was there before the face arrived. It was what allowed the face to mean something immediately, urgently, without prior instruction. The infant did not learn to need the mother by accumulating experiences of the mother, The need was structural, anticipatory, prior. The mother, arriving, activated something already waiting. This was the kind of observation Jung found quietly staggering, not in the dramatic sense, not as a revelation, but in the slow sense of a very large implication becoming gradually visible as the separate pieces of the evidence were held together long enough. The individual came into the world already prepared for certain encounters. The psyche arrived not as a blank page, but as a document already containing its structural outline, waiting for experience to fill in the specific content within the forms that were already there. And if that was true of the mother imago, and of the father imago, and of the shadow, and of the figure Jung would spend years attending to most carefully, the wise guide, the old presence, the figure that appeared at the threshold of genuine difficulty, then the individual human life was always, in some sense, a conversation between the particular and the ancient, between what had happened to this specific person in their specific history and what had been happening to the human psyche for as long as the human psyche had been the kind of thing it was. The lamp was burning lower in the study at Kusnacht. The Rig Veda lay open on the desk. The patient's notes from the previous day were in a folder beside it. Outside, the lake held the last light of the afternoon in its surface and then let it go. The thought that the two texts, ancient and contemporary, one from a tradition older than most of the civilizations that had ever existed, one from a woman in Zurich who had woken in the night and written down a dream, were describing, in their different vocabularies, the same underlying thing. This was not a thought that resolved cleanly. It was a thought that opened. It was a thought that opened. It was a thought that the longer it was held, revealed more rather than less, deepened rather than simplified, and asked more questions of the person holding it than it answered. Perhaps that was, in itself, a feature of the territory it was describing. The collective unconscious was not, in Jung's experience of it, either in his own inner life or in the clinical encounters where it pressed toward the surface, a thing that resolved into clarity and rest. It was more like the large, still body of water whose surface could be observed and whose depth could, with sufficient attention, be felt, even when it could not be measured. Standing at its edge was not like standing at the edge of a problem. It was like standing at the edge of a country, one that had always existed, that had always underlain the familiar landscape, that the familiar landscape was in some sense built on, even when those living on it had not turned their attention toward what lay beneath. An old man appears at the edge of a forest in a dream. He is seen by a child in Zurich in 1922. He has been seen in his same essential structure, wearing the face appropriate to each tradition, by a sailor in Polynesia, by a monk in medieval Europe, by a seeker in an ancient Egyptian temple, by a traveler in a Norse saga who did not yet know who it was that had offered him shelter for the night. Each one sees him in the particular form that their particular life and culture and language have given him. Each one recognizes in his presence something they could not have named in advance but know, immediately, as significant. Each one receives from him not what they were expecting to receive, and finds that what they did not expect was what they needed. The formal pattern beneath each of those encounters is the same. The wise figure, the moment of threshold, the knowledge offered from a depth the traveler cannot reach alone, the recognition that has no adequate biographical explanation. Some patterns in the human mind are older than any culture that has ever tried to name them. They were there before the names. They will be there when the names have changed, and the languages that carried them have passed into silence, and new languages have arisen to describe the same encounters in new terms that will also eventually pass. The child in Zurich wakes and cannot remember the old man's face clearly, but carries throughout the day a quality of having been addressed, of something having been offered, of a weight in the chest that is not grief, but something adjacent to it, the weight of having been in the presence of something very old. The sailor in Polynesia makes a mark on his boat's mast, a small circular mark, without knowing exactly why, only that the dream seemed to require some acknowledgement. The monk in medieval Europe writes 3 lines in his journal about a figure who appeared at the edge of his sleep and said nothing, only looked at him with a patience that seemed to predate the monastery, the church, the language the monk wrote in, the civilization that had built the walls around him. The pattern between them is what Jung had been sitting with at his desk in the lamplight, turning from one manuscript to the next, finding the structure beneath the surface. Patient as someone who has undertaken a very long counting, and knows that when the count is complete, the shape it reveals will have been worth every hour of the attention it required. The question the manuscripts raised, the question that the child's dream, and the sailor's mark, and the monk's 3 lines all pressed from their separate centuries and landscapes, was not easily set aside. When the mind produces a figure of such consistency, such authority, such specificity of character, across such distances of time and culture, a figure that arrives always at threshold and always from a depth the individual mind did not generate, what exactly is being described? Jung did not think the answer was simple. He did not think the answer was finally available in any form he had yet been able to produce. He thought it was one of the places where careful empirical observation led, without apology, to the edge of what careful empirical observation alone could resolve, a place where the question did not become less serious for being unanswerable, but more so. The lamp burned, the lake darkened. The old man at the edge of the forest waited in his various forms across all those centuries, and manuscripts and dream books and clinical notebooks, the same patience in each of his faces, the same quality of knowing something that the traveler standing before him had not yet had occasion to learn. Some patterns in the human mind do not belong to any single mind. They pass through each life the way light passes through the various windows of a long building, differently colored by each pane, differently angled by each aperture. But the same light, continuous, ancient, falling from a source older than any of the rooms, it briefly illuminates, and longer lasting than any of the walls that have been built to receive it. In the autumn of 1945, Jung sat at the long table inside the Bollingen Tower, the stone house he had built with his own hands on the southern shore of Lake Zurich, surrounded by handwritten notes that had accumulated over weeks of steady reading. The notes were about fairy tales. Grimm's collection was there, open and heavily marked. Norse saga manuscripts, alchemical texts with their strange illuminated margins, a volume on the folklore of the Slavic peoples, another on the oral traditions of West Africa, all of them opened to the same recurring figure. The old man who appears at the edge of the story, at the moment the hero has run out of road. Jung had been noticing this figure for a long time, across more traditions than any single researcher could have assembled alone. What interested him was not the old man's content, but his timing. He never arrived early. He was never present at the beginning, when the hero was confident and the path was clear. He appeared without exception when the forward motion had stopped, when the ordinary equipment of cleverness, strength, and good intention had proved insufficient, when the hero, exhausted, lost, sitting by the road, or standing at the threshold of something unknown, had finally admitted that they did not know what to do next. That moment of admission was the hinge the old man waited behind. Jung pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him and wrote at the top, "The old man always appears when the hero does not know how to proceed." He looked at the sentence for a moment. Then he drew a line beneath it and began. What Jung was attempting to name, in the essay that would become the phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales, was something he had spent years approaching from different angles. The figure had many names across traditions, many faces and many attributes. But beneath all of its local variations, Jung believed he was looking at a single psychic structure, a pattern the mind reached for when it arrived at a particular kind of threshold, a specific kind of inner authority that became available precisely when the authority of the ordinary, striving, goal-directed self had been exhausted. He called it the wise old man. In the older Latin of the scholarly tradition, the ****, or simply the archetype of spirit. The word spirit here needs to be understood in the way Jung meant it, rather than in any strictly religious sense. He was pointing at something the human psyche has always recognized as distinct from the ordinary operations of rational thought, a quality of knowing that seems to come from a different depth than analysis or accumulated experience. Not irrational, nothing in Jung's framework was simply irrational, but operating according to principles that reason, working alone, cannot reach. When someone describes a dream in which an old figure spoke a few words that reorganized the whole of their understanding of their life, the words themselves are often simple. The transformation is not in the content, it is in what seems to be behind the content, a depth of perspective that the dreamer feels rather than reasons toward, and that remains after the specific words are forgotten. This quality, the particular felt sense of being addressed by something that knows more than the ordinary mind has access to, was what Jung meant by spirit, and the wise old man was the psyche's characteristic way of giving that quality a face. The essay took shape across several weeks of autumn work, with the lake visible from the tower's single narrow window, and the light changing each day as November settled into the stone. Jung had specific case material close at hand. He had decades of clinical observation to draw from. But the most striking evidence was in the stories themselves, the sheer consistency with which this figure appeared, always in the same structural position, always serving the same psychological function, always leaving the hero not with an answer but with something that made an answer possible. In a typical grim tale, the pattern is precise. The hero is the youngest son, often considered foolish, who has been sent on a quest that his cleverer brothers have already failed. He sets out. He attempts the obvious approaches. He fails. He sits down at a crossroads, or at the edge of a forest, or beside a river he cannot cross, and he does not know what to do next. At this point, an old man appears, poor-looking, easily dismissed, sometimes deformed or ragged, and asks the hero a simple question, or offers a small gift, or tells him something that seems irrelevant. The hero who respects the encounter, who takes the question seriously, who accepts the gift without condescension, proceeds. The hero who dismisses the old man as beneath his attention does not. Jung noticed that this structure was not arbitrary. It encoded something psychologically precise. The wise old man does not appear to the hero, who still believes their own intelligence is sufficient. He appears after that belief has been relinquished. His appearance is itself a kind of test, because the figure is always humble in form, easily overlooked, never presenting itself as a figure of obvious authority. The wisdom is never announced. It arrives disguised as a question, or an offer of companionship, or a piece of information that seems at first too small to matter. What this encodes, Jung believed, is a real observation about how the deeper intelligence of the psyche operates. It does not overwhelm, it offers. It can be refused. The ego must reach toward it with a quality of openness and respect, or the encounter produces nothing. This was not merely a narrative convention, it was a psychological fact given symbolic form. Within the framework Jung had spent decades developing, the wise old man held a specific position. He was the inner figure who stood between the ego, the historically conditioned, socially shaped, personally experienced self, who manages the business of ordinary life, and what Jung called the self, the larger totality. The psyche is oriented toward the whole of what a person is and might become, which always exceeds what the ego alone has managed to realize. The wise old man was the mediating presence. He was the part of the deeper psyche that had found a way to speak to the surface, to address the conscious personality in its own symbolic language, to offer guidance that could actually be received. This mediation was most necessary at thresholds, at the moments in a life when one chapter has genuinely ended and the next has not yet become clear, when a person has followed a path faithfully and found it ending at a door they do not know how to open. When willpower, which had always worked before, is discovering its own limits. When the accumulated wisdom of lived experience, which is real and not to be dismissed, is encountering a situation that accumulated experience alone cannot navigate. These moments, Jung observed, occurred at recognizable points in a life. In midlife, when the identity built in the first half, the career, the relationships, the social persona, shaped by ambition and necessity, begins to feel insufficient for what the second half is asking. After a significant loss, when the structure of ordinary meaning has been disrupted and has not yet reformed, at the transitions between major stages of development, when the self that served one period of life must be released to make way for what the next requires. At all of these thresholds, something tends to happen in the interior life. Dreams change character. They become more vivid, more insistent, more populated with figures that carry a weight of authority the dreamer cannot explain. The images that arise in the quiet between sleep and waking carry an atmosphere that the daylight self struggles to account for. And in this altered interior weather, the wise old man appears. Not always, not reliably, but characteristically, as if the psyche, pressed to the edge of its ordinary resources, activates a deeper layer of its own intelligence and finds a face for it. Jung called this activation asterisk constellation asterisk. The archetype, until this moment, is latent, present as a formal tendency, a shape the psyche is capable of taking, but not yet active. When life arrives at the threshold conditions the archetype responds to, it is constellated. It enters the field of the psyche's experience with force. It generates not only images, but an atmosphere, the particular quality of feeling that attends a genuinely numinous encounter, the sense of being in the presence of something that exceeds the ordinary categories of the waking mind. When an archetype is constellated, the experience is unmistakable in quality, even when it is difficult to describe. It has what Jung, borrowing from the theologian Rudolf Otto, called a numinous quality, something that is simultaneously awesome and intimate, something that the ego did not generate and cannot fully contain, something that seems to arrive from outside the personality's ordinary range, even when it arises entirely within the interior life. The dreamer who wakes from an encounter with the wise old man often cannot report the exact content of what was said, but the quality of having been addressed by something that knew them completely, that quality remains intact and precise. The wise old man has two modes of appearing in a life, and Jung drew a careful distinction between them. The first is as an autonomous inner figure encountered in dreams in the borderland states between sleeping and waking, or in the practice of active imagination, where the conscious mind enters a receptive attention and engages directly with the images that arise from the deeper psyche. In this first mode, the archetype appears as an interior presence. It has its own consistency across encounters. It speaks in a recognizable voice. It is genuinely other than the ego and cannot be reduced to the ego's own wishes or fears, though the ego may try to make that reduction. The second mode is through projection. The archetype, unable to make itself known from within, perhaps because the interior life is not yet prepared for direct encounter, or because the projecting person has not yet developed the capacity to recognize an interior authority, attaches itself to an external person. A teacher encountered at a formative moment. A therapist whose presence carries, for a particular patient, an atmosphere of understanding that exceeds the merely professional. A cultural figure, a philosopher, a religious authority, a writer who comes to hold, for a reader, a weight of significance that goes beyond the content of what they have written or said. Projection of this kind is not a mistake. It is, in many cases, the first form in which the archetype becomes available at all. The encounter with an external person who carries the projected qualities of the wise old man can be genuinely transformative, can open the interior toward a depth it did not previously know how to access, can begin a process of self-understanding that would not have been available without that initial outer form. The person onto whom the projection falls is not simply a screen for the projector's inner life. They are real, and the relationship is real, but something additional is happening in the encounter, something that exceeds what either person in it could account for by ordinary means. The development comes when the projection can begin to be withdrawn, when the individual, having been transformed by the encounter with the outer figure, begins to recognize that what they were reaching for in that figure is also reachable within. When the teacher's wisdom is understood, not as belonging uniquely to the teacher, but as pointing toward a capacity in the student that the student was not yet able to see directly and needed for a time to see reflected back from the outside. This process of withdrawal and internalization, slow, never fully complete, always partial, is one of the central movements of what Jung understood as psychological maturation. There is a difficulty, though, in the wise old man's shadow. Jung's framework always held that the most powerful psychic structures carry both the capacity for genuine development and the capacity for the deepest distortion. The wise old man is no exception. The same archetype that appears as the genuine inner guide, the humble old man at the edge of the forest, who offers the single question that opens the way forward, has a negative form, a dark twin who wears the same robes but serves a different function entirely. This shadow version is the false prophet, the manipulative authority who borrows the archetype's atmosphere of depth and wisdom and uses it not to open but to close, not to return the seeker to their own inner authority, but to bind them more permanently to an external one, the figure who possesses all the forms of wisdom, the tone, the bearing, the quality of seeming to know, but in whom the living substance has gone rigid, the cold intellectual who commands immense understanding of ideas, but in whom the ideas have lost contact with life, the dogmatic systematizer who has taken a genuine insight and extended it until it has become a wall rather than a window. These figures exist in history. They exist in the consulting rooms of therapists who have not done sufficient work on their own psychology. They exist in lecture halls and in the structures of religious authority. They exist in the inner life as well, as the internal voice that speaks with the authority of wisdom and yet produces, over time, not the enlargement that genuine wisdom produces, but a gradual constriction, not more life, but less, not a return of the seeker to their own depths, but an increasing dependence on external authority that the false prophet quietly ensures will not be outgrown. Jung observed this pattern with considerable care, because he was himself a figure onto whom the archetype was projected by many who sought him out. He knew from the inside how the projection felt, the temptation it carried, the psychic force it exerted, the responsibility it placed on the person who carried it. He wrote about this not in a spirit of moral warning, but in the spirit of someone who had observed the pattern closely enough to understand its internal mechanics. The false prophet is not always, or even usually, consciously fraudulent. The shadow of the wise old man can operate through a person who genuinely believes they have what others are seeking. This is the aspect of the shadow that makes it genuinely dangerous. It does not present itself as dangerous. It presents itself as the thing people most need. There is a related hazard that Jung identified as perhaps more personally insidious, the situation he called identification with the archetype rather than relationship to it. When the wise old man is constellated in a person's inner life, there is a temptation, subtle and powerful, to become the figure rather than encounter it, to take the archetype's atmosphere of authority and omniscience into the ego, to speak from it rather than to it, to assume that because the archetype has been present, its qualities now belong to the person. This is what Jung called inflation. The ego, ordinarily limited to its own human scale, inflates to the dimensions of the archetype. It becomes, in its own internal experience, the sage, the prophet, the one who knows. Inflation of this kind produces a recognizable quality. There is a certainty that feels unassailable, not because the certainty has been tested, but because it seems to come from a level of authority that is beyond questioning. There is a loss of ordinary doubt, not the freedom from anxiety that genuine maturity produces, but the absence of the productive uncertainty that keeps the mind honest. There is a quality of being above the ordinary processes of correction and revision, and beneath all of this, usually invisible to the inflated person, but often quite clear to those around them, there is a fragility, because inflation is inherently unstable, because the ego cannot sustain the dimensions of an archetype indefinitely, and because when the inflation collapses, as it must, the distance fallen is proportional to the height reached. The way through both of these shadows, the false prophet as external figure and the inflation as internal event, is the same in Jung's understanding. It is relationship rather than identification, to encounter the wise old man as genuinely other, to speak to the figure rather than becoming it, to receive what the encounter offers without claiming to own what was offered, to understand that the archetype's wisdom, when it arrives through the interior life, is not the ego's achievement. It is a visitation it passes through. The right response to it is the response the hero in the fairy tale, who succeeds, gives to the humble old man at the crossroads: attention, respect, genuine engagement, and then the willingness to proceed independently with whatever was received, without holding on to the figure itself. The figure who embodies this passage most completely, in Jung's personal experience, is Philemon, the winged, lame old man who appeared in Jung's waking visions during the years of his inner crisis, who spoke in sentences Jung could not account for as his own thought, who carried an atmosphere of wisdom that exceeded what Jung understood himself to possess, was not, in Jung's own account, a fantasy or a projection in the dismissive sense. He was an autonomous presence. Jung used that word with care and with full awareness of its implications. Autonomous, possessing an independence from the ego's agency. Philemon arrived. He spoke. He did not simply reflect back what Jung already thought. He added something. He said things that Jung had to think about afterward, as one thinks about something that another real person has said. This direct interior encounter was not, for Jung, evidence that the psyche contains a supernatural agency. It was evidence of something almost more interesting, that the psyche has depths from which genuinely new content can arise. That the mind, in its unknown layers, is capable of a wisdom that the conscious personality has not reached. That the conversation with one's own interior life, pursued with the discipline and respect one would bring to a conversation with a genuinely wise external person, can produce the same kind of enlargement. Philemon continued to appear across many years of Jung's inner life as an interior companion. Jung described walking in the garden at Küsnacht in the evenings and feeling Philemon's presence beside him, as one feels the presence of someone who has been in a room long enough to change its atmosphere. The figure moved through the garden with an uneven gait, one foot dragging slightly, and with the large, strange wings that belonged to no creature the waking world contained. He did not always speak. The presence itself carried a quality that Jung associated with the archetype's deepest gift, not a piece of information, but a perspective, a way of standing in relation to one's own life that was larger than the ordinary self could sustain alone. The essay Jung finished at Bollingen in the autumn of 1945 would eventually be read alongside the clinical material of Aeon, which came 6 years later. Together they constitute the most careful attempt Jung made to give the wise old man archetype its full psychological and philosophical treatment. But the material was always, beneath its scholarly surface, reaching towards something that the scholarship alone could not deliver, the direct experiential reality of the figure, which no number of fairy tale citations could substitute for. A person in midlife, lying awake at 3 a.m, after a career has ended or a marriage has dissolved, or a certainty they had carried for decades has quietly come apart in their hands. That person is not, in Jung's view, simply in distress. They are at the threshold. They are in the structural position of the hero who has arrived at the crossroads after the conventional approaches have been tried and have not been enough. The ordinary equipment, willpower, rational analysis, the advice of people who love them, remains available and is not to be dismissed. But something else has also become available, something that becomes available precisely because the ordinary resources have been exhausted. The question the wise old man places before the hero in the fairy tale is not a trick question. It is not even usually a particularly complex question. It is simply the question that the hero, in their urgency to solve the problem by heroic means, has not yet stopped long enough to ask, what is actually happening here, beneath the surface of what seems to be happening? What is this situation asking of me, rather than from me? What would I know, if I were willing to be still long enough to know it? These are the questions the figure at the crossroads represents, not as abstract philosophical puzzles, as the living edge of a real situation in a real life where something more than cleverness is being asked for. A young student sitting in a lecture hall before a professor of 70 years sometimes feels something in the presence of that person that has little to do with the content of the lecture. The professor may be saying something entirely ordinary, but the quality of the presence itself, the way the professor holds a question without needing it to resolve immediately, the way they inhabit their own uncertainty without anxiety, the way decades of serious engagement with difficult material have settled into a kind of groundedness that the student cannot fully name but can feel quite clearly. That quality is the archetype's signal. The student is not mistaken in feeling it. Something real is being transmitted. But the transmission is not only from the professor, it is from the student's own deeper psyche, which is using the professor's genuine qualities as a focal point for recognizing a potential in the student's own interior life that has not yet fully surfaced. This is the subtlety of the projection that makes it useful rather than merely misleading. The external figure must have real qualities for the projection to hold. The wise old man archetype does not attach itself randomly to figures of mere social authority. It attaches to people who genuinely carry something of the archetype's living substance, in whom wisdom is actual rather than performed, in whom the long encounter with difficulty has produced perspective rather than bitterness, in whom the willingness to remain in uncertainty has not collapsed into either dogmatism or despair. The archetype is, in this sense, a precise instrument. It finds its way to what is real in the outer world, even as it is pointing toward what is real in the interior one. What the student is recognizing in the professor, and the dreamer is recognizing in the dream figure, and the fairy tale hero is recognizing in the humble old man at the crossroads, is the same quality from different angles. A knowledge that is not merely accumulated information, a perspective that comes from having inhabited the questions long enough for the urgency to drain out of them, a relationship with time that is different from the ego's ordinary relationship with time, less investment in the outcome, more attention to the present reality of the situation. These are qualities that can be encountered from the outside, projected onto a real person, and that encounter can be genuinely valuable. But they are also qualities that exist in potential in every person who is willing to go far enough inward to find them. This is what makes the wise old man something other than simply a helpful character in stories. He is the psyche's own image of its own deepest capacity. He is what wisdom looks like when it has been in place long enough to lose its urgency and become simply the natural atmosphere of a certain interior depth. The ego, looking at him, is looking at something it might become, not through achievement or ambition, but through the particular kind of living that the encounter itself invites, through the willingness to sit at the crossroads, through the patience to let the old man finish speaking before starting to walk, through the trust which grows slowly and cannot be rushed, that the direction indicated is not arbitrary even when it is not fully understood. The shadow of this capacity is always present. The figure at the crossroads might be the genuine guide, or might be the false prophet wearing the same robes. The internal voice speaking in the register of deep wisdom might be genuine orientation, or might be inflation, disguised as insight. Jung did not pretend that these distinctions were always easy to make. He did not offer a simple test. He offered, instead, a quality of attention. The genuine guide leaves the seeker more capable of independent navigation, not less. The genuine integration of the wise old man archetype leaves the ego enlarged, but not displaced, still itself, still responsible for its own choices, but with access to a perspective it did not previously have. The distortion leaves dependency, the genuine integration leaves freedom. The essay Jung completed at Bollingen in 1945 circled around this distinction from many directions without ever reducing it to a formula. Because some things Jung understood cannot be known in advance. They can only be known in the encounter itself by the quality of what the encounter produces over time. The hero in the fairy tale who meets the old man at the crossroads does not always immediately know whether to trust him. They have to choose with incomplete information, under the pressure of genuine need, in the direction their instincts and their attention and their willingness to receive point them toward. The choice is not guaranteed. The wisdom received may still be misapplied. The gift given may be misused. But the encounter itself, the stopping at the crossroads, the attention given to the humble figure, the willingness to receive guidance from an unexpected source, that is already the beginning of the movement through. By the time Jung set down his pen in the autumn quiet of the Bollingen Tower, the lake had gone gray outside the window, and the light had fallen to the low horizontal warmth of late afternoon. The notes on the table were dense and numerous. The essay was taking the shape that would carry it into print. The old man in the fairy tale had been approached from many angles, named in many traditions, located in many structural positions within many narratives, and had emerged from all that examination still essentially intact, still recognizable, still present at the same threshold, still asking the same kind of question in the same kind of voice. Jung gathered the pages and set them in order. He had spent the better part of a decade in direct personal relationship with a figure he could not account for as his own thought. He had spent another 3 decades observing the same figure arrive in the interior lives of patients who had never heard of Philemon. He had traced the figure across dozens of traditions, found it in the humblest folk tale and in the most elevated religious text, found it always performing the same structural function, always appearing when the ordinary resources had run out. All of that observation had brought him to a conclusion that was, at its core, quite simple. There is something in the human psyche that knows more than the conscious mind has reached, something that the ego, at its ordinary scale, cannot access by effort alone. And this something, when the conditions are right, when the threshold has been genuinely arrived at, when the ego has genuinely exhausted its conventional approaches and is capable of a real receptivity, takes the form of an old man at the edge of a road, waiting with patience that has no urgency in it, ready to offer the single question that opens the way forward. The crossroads itself is where the section comes to rest. Not the figure who stood there. He has done what he came to do and is already gone. Not the hero who has taken the gift and moved on into whatever the path holds next. Just the crossroads, the place where several possibilities converge, and none of them leads anywhere until the traveler, stopped and still for the first time in a long effort, has the interior space to recognize what each of them actually is. Wisdom, in Jung's understanding, does not remain to be owned. It passes through. The encounter leaves not a permanent possession, but a change in capacity, a deepened ability to hold a question without urgency, to sit at the crossroads without demanding that it resolve immediately, to receive what arrives from an unexpected direction with the kind of attention that allows something to be genuinely received rather than merely noted and set aside. The old man is gone. The crossroads remains. And the traveler, standing there in the changed quality of the air that follows an encounter they cannot fully account for, finds that they know, quietly and without needing to know how they know it, which way to walk. A scholar is working alone in the library at Alexandria in the late afternoon of some day in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The other scholars have gone. The long room has emptied in the way rooms empty when the day is almost done. Gradually, then all at once, and now there is only the horizontal light moving across the shelves, and the faint smell of papyrus and sea salt drifting in from somewhere, and the man himself bending over a newly transcribed text he has been waiting weeks to read. He unrolls it carefully. The papyrus is stiff and pale. The title, in a careful hand at the top of the column, reads Poemandres, the shepherd of men, or perhaps the mind of sovereignty, the Greek holding both meanings at once without settling. He reads the opening lines aloud to himself, in a low voice, not for anyone else, simply because the language requires it. The text begins with a vision. A vast and luminous being appears. A darkness moves through the vision like a serpent, coiling and crying out. Then a voice asks, "What do you wish to hear and see?" He stops there. He reads the question again. What do you wish to hear and see? Not what do you believe, not what have you studied, but what do you wish now in this moment to know? He sets the scroll down slowly on the reading table, and for a moment he does not move. Something in the framing of that first question has not behaved like a philosophical text. It has behaved like something looking back. The Corpus Hermeticum, the collection of texts attributed to the legendary figure of Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, arrived in the ancient world not as a single work, but as a gathering, assembled over centuries from multiple authors, writing under a single vast name. Hermes Trismegistus was himself already a composite, the Greek messenger god, fleet-footed, quick-minded, the guide of souls between worlds, merged with Thoth, the Egyptian scribe of divine knowledge, the keeper of the sacred records, the one who weighed the dead. Two traditions had looked at each other across the Mediterranean and found in each a figure they recognized. The name that resulted was large enough to hold both of them, and larger still. What the Hermetic texts described, taken together, was the soul's long descent into matter and its possible return, a journey outward into density and forgetfulness, and a journey back toward the luminous source from which it had come. The figure of the guide in this journey, the old teacher, the mind shepherd, the one who appeared at the beginning of the vision and asked the opening question, was not a god in the ordinary sense. He did not command. He did not punish. He appeared. He asked what the seeker wished to know, and then he showed it. And the showing was not always comfortable, and the seeker was not always ready, but the guide remained patient. He had, the texts implied, been waiting for exactly as long as it took. In the late afternoon light of the Alexandrian library, the scholar who had just read the opening question of the Poemandres aloud to himself was not thinking about archetypes or depth psychology. Those words did not exist yet, and would not exist for 17 more centuries. He was thinking about the figure in the vision, the vast luminous being who spoke, who waited, who taught, and about whether what the text was describing was a god, a philosophical principle, a personification of the highest intellect, or something that did not quite fit any of those categories, something that seemed, in the quality of its presence in the text, genuinely alive, not manufactured, not invented to carry a doctrine. This is the quality that recurs, not the doctrine, which changes from tradition to tradition, and not the name, which is never stable, but the quality of presence, the sense that the figure in the text or the dream or the story is not decorating someone else's argument, but is itself the argument, that the wisdom does not belong to the figure's second hand, but is somehow what the figure is made of, the way water is what a river is made of. Across the centuries, across traditions that had no contact with each other and no shared vocabulary, this quality appears and reappears with a consistency that cannot be explained by borrowing alone. The earliest records of Socrates describe a man who is, in almost every external respect, the least likely candidate for the role of wise guide. He was not wealthy, he had no school, No library, no written works. He left nothing in writing. A fact so strange in the context of Athenian intellectual life that it requires explanation, and the explanation Socrates himself offered was that written words were inferior to the living conversation, which could respond to the interlocutor's actual confusion rather than delivering a fixed position to a reader who might not be ready for it. He was barefoot frequently. He was known to stand motionless for hours, absorbed in some interior process no one around him could see. He had a snub nose and a stocky figure, and a manner that some people found maddening and others found transformative. And the difference between those two responses seemed to depend entirely on whether the person in question was willing to discover that they did not know what they thought they knew. In the Athenian agora, in the early morning, before the heat of the day had settled, Socrates would stop people. Not rudely, there was nothing aggressive in the manner, by the accounts that survive. He would stop a man who had just come from the oracle at Delphi, a man flushed with certainty, a man who had just received divine instruction and felt the authority of it still in his body, and Socrates would ask him, with what sounded like genuine curiosity, "What exactly do you believe you know?" Not as an attack, as a question. And the long silence that followed before the man attempted an answer was the space in which the oracle's authority began, very quietly, to require examination. This is what Socrates called asterisk maiutics, asterisk, the midwifery of ideas. He was not putting knowledge into his interlocutors. He insisted, drawing out what was already there, already known at some level the person had not yet accessed, already present in the structure of the question the person was carrying, without knowing they were carrying it. His own knowledge, he maintained, was purely negative. He knew that he did not know, and this knowing of not knowing was itself the beginning. The asterisk daimonion asterisk, the inner voice or divine sign that Socrates described as his constant companion, did not tell him what to think. It did not deliver answers. It prohibited. It held him back from certain actions, certain paths, certain conclusions that had not been sufficiently examined. A guide that operates through restraint rather than direction. A presence that makes space by removing the easy options. The trial that ended his life was, in a way, the final demonstration of this principle. Socrates could have gone into exile. He could have agreed to stop philosophizing. He could have made the gestures that would have preserved him. The asterisk daimonion asterisk did not urge any of those paths. The inner guide held the boundary, and what was left when every escape route had been closed was the question itself, standing alone in the room, requiring an answer at the cost of a life. Far to the north, in the cold of the Norse world, a different figure was making his way through the settlements. He was old, this one, and he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who has learned not to waste motion. One eye was gone, traded, long ago, for a single draught from the well that lay at the base of the world tree, the well of Mimir where cosmic memory was kept. The eye was not lost. It was still there, at the bottom of the well, still seeing everything that had ever happened, the whole record, preserved in water. Odin had decided this was a fair exchange. What he saw through one remaining eye after that trade was sharpened by the knowledge that the other eye was still working, still watching, from a depth he could not directly see. He hung from the tree for 9 days and 9 nights. This is not a metaphor in the Norse tradition, or not primarily one. It is a precise description of what the attainment of the runes required. The runes were not a gift. They were not handed down from a greater authority as a reward for good behavior. They were found, the myth says, by Odin himself, through the ordeal of hanging, wounded, fasting, without comfort, peering down into the darkness below until the shapes that had always been there finally rose into visibility. He stooped and took them up. He screamed when he had them, not with pain, the myth implies, but with recognition. The shapes had been there all along. The hanging had merely made him still enough, empty enough, to see them. The scholar Hilda Ellis Davidson, writing about the Northern European tradition, observed that wisdom in this world was never simply inherited. It could not be passed from teacher to student by ordinary instruction, accumulated through effort of study, or purchased from an authority who possessed it in surplus. It had to be won through the specific kind of diminishment that Odin's ordeal described, the willingness to give up what one would ordinarily protect most fiercely, the eye that saw the familiar world, the stability of a fixed position, the comfort of a known ground. What emerged on the other side of that willingness was not the same self with more information. It was something the old self could not have predicted, because the old self had not yet been through the darkness that changed the quality of seeing itself. The disguised wanderer who walked into the Norse settlements was the same figure, post-ordeal, traveling with a limp in some versions and a broad-brimmed hat pulled low, stopping at the fires of chieftains and asking for a meal and a night's shelter, carrying a staff and a quality of attention that was not quite like the attention of other travelers. He would leave before dawn. Years later, in the particular way the Norse myths work, there would be a reckoning, a moment when the chieftain understood who it was that had sat at his table, had been fed by his hand, had asked the questions, and told the stories, and then walked back out into the dark. The wisdom had been in the room all night. The host had not recognized it until it was gone. This is one of the archetype's most consistent structural features. Across traditions that had no knowledge of each other, the pattern holds. The figure arrives in a form that does not announce its authority, often in poverty or physical diminishment, and the recognition of what the figure was comes after the encounter rather than during it. The test, for it is often a test, is precisely whether the person in question can respond with hospitality, with openness, with genuine curiosity to something that does not look like wisdom. The figure does not appear in robes or with a halo or trailing obvious signs of power. It appears in the Norse versions as a one-eyed old man leaning on a staff. In the fairy tale versions it appears, as the story makes explicit, poor and lame and easily overlooked, stopping beside the hero at the side of the road. Wast wordt uit of grat. The road in these stories matters. The hero has tried everything. Every conventional approach to the problem has been exhausted. The weapons did not work. The plans did not hold. The allies could not help. He is sitting at the side of the road in the particular posture of someone who has used up all the resources they knew they had and has not yet discovered that a different kind of resource exists. He is not ready. He is sitting down precisely because he is not ready, because for the moment every path ahead looks the same and equally impassable. It is into this specific condition, the exhaustion of the known, that the old figure steps. It does not always look like stepping. In some stories it shuffles. In some it limps. The physical imperfection of the figure is not incidental. It marks the figure as having been through something, as carrying the knowledge that comes only from the far side of loss. The wolf's bite, the tree's wound, the traded eye. The wisdom is not theoretical. It has been paid for. And what the figure asks the sitting hero is always, in one form or another, the same question Socrates asked. What do you believe you need? What do you think you are looking for? Not to mock the answer, but because the answer, honestly given, tends to reveal its own incompleteness, and that incompleteness is the opening on the other side of the world in the intellectual tradition that would eventually be gathered under the name Taoism. A figure was taking shape that bore almost no structural resemblance to Odin or to Socrates, and yet occupied, within its tradition, something recognizably similar to the position they occupied within theirs. The legendary Laozi, old, white-haired, departing composed, was associated with a form of wisdom that operated not through the destabilizing question and not through the ordeal of self-diminishment, but through something still quieter than either of those. The Tao that can be named, the tradition begins, is not the eternal Tao. The first sentence is already a warning about the limits of naming, including the name of the thing the sentence is about. In centuries of Chinese ink brush painting, Laozi is almost always shown in the same way. He is on an ox. He is moving through a mountain pass, usually at the edge of the cultivated world, usually with the open sky very large and pale above him. The ox moves at its own pace, which is slow and untroubled. The old man does not appear to be directing it. He is leaning slightly, occasionally as though reading the landscape, rather than watching where he is going. His posture is neither urgent nor resigned. The manuscript, 5,000 characters, the whole of the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk, dictated to a gatekeeper who asked for it before Laozi passed out of the world entirely, is apparently already written. There is nothing left to carry. The destination in these paintings is always the mountains, always ahead, always unnamed. The concept at the center of the Taoist sage's mode of guidance is asterisk wu wei asterisk, a term that resists direct translation but points toward action that flows without forcing, presence that influences without imposing, the particular kind of power that belongs to water, to open valleys, to the uncarved block of wood before anything has been cut from it. The sage in this tradition is not a teacher in the ordinary sense, because the ordinary sense of teaching, the transmission of settled knowledge from one who has it to one who does not, is precisely what the tradition distrusts. The Taoist sage's wisdom manifests most fully in what is withheld, in the space created by not speaking, not compelling, not filling. The student who leaves the encounter uncertain whether anything has been communicated is often closer to the tradition's intention than the one who feels instructed. This is not passivity. Asterisk wu wei. Asterisk is not inaction, but a particular quality of action, action that has relinquished the ego's ambition to be seen as the cause of whatever follows. The sage's guidance works on the principle that a valley is useful precisely because it is empty, that the utility of a vessel depends on the hollow at its center, that whatever fills the container was not manufactured by the container. What the Taoist sage figure offers is a quality of receptivity so complete that the person in the sage's presence finds themselves, without quite knowing how it happened, having moved, not pushed, not instructed, moved. The manuscript has always already been written. That is the detail in the story that carries the particular weight of this tradition. Laukazi does not pause to compose his 5,000 characters in response to an urgent question, does not struggle to articulate what he has spent decades working toward. When the gatekeeper asks, the text comes complete, as though it has been waiting for the request rather than produced by it. The wisdom did not begin when the question was asked. It was already there, in the old man on the ox, patient as stone, old as the mountains ahead, moving toward the pass at the pace the ox chose, without any correction. The library at Alexandria, where the scholar first encountered Hermes Trismegistus, was, by the time of his reading, already very old. The texts of the asterisk Corpus Hermeticum asterisk had been gathered over centuries from sources no single scholar could fully trace. Egyptian temple tradition, Platonist philosophy, strands of what would later be called Gnosticism, accounts of visionary experiences so specific in their imagery that they resisted easy classification as either theology or philosophy. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus stood over all of it, lending a name and a single implied authorship to material that had in fact accreted across multiple generations and multiple traditions, in the way that wisdom traditions sometimes coalesce around a figure large enough to contain them. What the figure of Hermes Trismegistus brought together, the messenger who moves between worlds and the scribe who records what cannot be lost, was a combination that the Hermetic texts expressed in terms of the soul's journey. The soul descended, it forgot. It was clothed in matter and moved through the spheres of the planets on the way down, acquiring at each sphere a quality it would have to shed on the way back. One planet for the outer will, another for ambition, another for the drive to accumulate, another for arrogance, another for hasty judgment, another for the appetite that binds the self to what it cannot keep. By the time the soul arrived in the body, it was, by these accounts, almost entirely covered over. The original light was still there, the texts insisted, but very deep, and the surface was very dense. The guide in this descent was also the guide in the return. Hermes, who led the souls down, was Hermes, who could lead them back. The same knowledge that recorded the forgetting could point toward the remembering. The Rican knowledge this is not a paradox the Hermetic tradition resolved. Exactly, it is a tension it held and found generative. The figure who knew the depths knew them because he had gone there. The figure who could guide the soul back was not standing at a comfortable distance from the darkness, pointing toward it from safety. The figure had been through it and was on the other side, and the other side is what made the guidance possible, not theory. Passage? There is a monastery in the countryside outside of the city in the 19th century, Russian, Orthodox, surrounded by birch trees, in a landscape so flat and so still that the sky seems almost horizontal over it in every season. Inside the monastery, there is an elder, a asterisk stare, asterisk, which is simply the Russian word for an old man, though in the tradition of the Russian Orthodox spiritual life, it carries a weight. The word old man in ordinary speech cannot contain. The asterisk startsi asterisk were believed to possess a gift, the tradition called asterisk diorsis asterisk, the discernment of spirits, the capacity to see into the interior of the person in front of them, to perceive what was hidden even from the person themselves, and to respond to what was actually there rather than to what was presented. Father Zosima, in Dostoevsky's great novel, drawn in part from the actual tradition of the asterisk. Startsi asterisk, and in part from the specific figure of the elder Ambrosi of Optina, whom Dostoevsky visited, is perhaps the most compassionate instance of the archetype in the whole of world literature. Otherwise, old men in the tradition operate through question, through ordeal, through the destabilizing pressure of a presence that refuses easy answers. Father Zosima operates through something else, the quality of attention that Dostoevsky himself described in his notebooks as the capacity to love the world as it actually is, rather than as one wishes it to be, not sentimental love, which requires the world to be different, not the love that demands transformation before it can be extended, love that looks at the actual person in the actual confusion and finds there's something worth absolute attention. A young man travels 3 days on foot to reach the monastery with a question he cannot articulate. This is the part the novels about wisdom always get right. The question is not yet fully formed when the journey begins. It becomes more fully formed with each day of walking. By the time he arrives, he has a version of it, assembled from the long hours of walking through birch forests and empty fields. But he is not certain it is the right question, and he is not certain he has the courage to ask it. He is shown to the elder's cell. The elder is sitting, already old, already marked by the long discipline that has shaped the face into something that no longer resembles the faces of people who have not spent decades in interior practice. The elder looks at him, not at the question, at him. The silence lasts a long time. When the elder speaks, Dostoevsky understood. He does not answer the question the young man asked. He answers the question the young man had not yet found language for, the one beneath the presenting question, the one that had been driving the 3-day walk without ever quite surfacing into words. This is the tradition of asterisk diaeresis, asterisk made narrative, the capacity to see through the surface of what is being said to the actual weight, bearing down on the person saying it. And the wisdom in this mode is not impressive. It does not display its authority. It simply addresses what is actually there, directly, without performance. And the young man in the cell afterwards cannot entirely account for why the hour he spent there changed the quality of everything that followed. The figure Dostoevsky was drawing on was historical. The elder Amvrasi of Optina, whose wooden hermitage was reached by a path through pine trees, was visited by thousands of people in the decades of his active ministry, peasants and aristocrats, doubters and believers, people who had traveled very far with questions of every possible kind. His method, by the accounts that survive, was remarkably consistent. He listened first. He listened for a long time, and the listening was not passive in the way. Waiting for the other person to finish speaking is passive. It was active, attentive, oriented toward what was underneath rather than what was on the surface. Then he spoke briefly, usually with an unexpected lightness. He was known for a kind of humor that seemed to come from having long since ceased to take the ego's drama at the level of crisis the ego believed it required. And then the person left, and the path through the pine trees was the same path as before, and the trees were the same trees, and the sky was the same cold Russian sky, and somehow everything had shifted. All of these figures, the barefoot questioner in the morning, Agora, the one-eyed wanderer with the broad-brimmed hat, the old man on the ox at the edge of the world, the thrice-great guide of the Hermetic mysteries, the elder in the monastery cell, were operating in traditions that had no direct knowledge of each other and no shared theoretical vocabulary for what they were describing. The Greek philosophical tradition, the Norse mythological tradition, the Chinese philosophical tradition, the Egyptian Greek Hermetic tradition, the Russian Orthodox spiritual tradition, these are not variations on a common cultural inheritance. They grew from different soils, in different climates, addressing different questions, shaped by pressures the others would not have recognized. And yet the figure that appears at the center of each of them, at the moment when ordinary resources are exhausted, when the path ahead is not visible, when the question has become too large for the questioner's current capacity, is the same figure in every structurally essential way. He does not announce himself. He appears in poverty, or in disguise, or in simplicity, in a form that does not require reverence and does not demand it. He asks before he answers, and often the asking is itself the answer, because the question he asks is not the question the person in front of him thinks needs answering. He does not hold the wisdom as a possession to be transferred. He holds it as a quality of presence, and what happens in the space between the guide and the seeker is not instruction, but something more like conduction, the way warmth moves from one body to another, not through explanation, but through proximity. He does not stay. He points, or he speaks, or he simply sits in a quality of attention that no one present can quite account for, and then he is gone, or the conversation ends, or the encounter concludes without ceremony, and what is left is not information, but a capacity the person did not have before. Standing above all of these traditions simultaneously, not inside any one of them, but at a height from which all of them are visible at once, a certain quality becomes apparent that no single tradition could have shown from within itself. The figure has been here for as long as there have been records of human interiority. In the earliest texts, in the oral traditions older than texts, in the myths that traveled across land bridges before writing, in the dreams recorded by shamanic practitioners, in cultures that left no other documents. Wherever there is a record of human beings encountering their own psychological limit, the figure appears, not always clearly, not always in forms that announce themselves as wisdom, sometimes only as a quality of light at the edge of the story, or a voice that speaks once and is not heard again, or an old man in the distance of the dream, who does not come closer, but whose presence in the landscape changes the quality of everything visible from where the dreamer stands. The Hermetic scholar who unrolled the asterisk poimandres, asterisk in the long horizontal light of the afternoon, and read the opening question aloud to himself, "What do you wish to hear and see?" was not yet aware, as he read, that he was participating in a pattern as old as the tradition of inner inquiry itself. He was simply reading. The light moved across the table. The papyrus held its shape under his hands. The figure in the text looked back at him from across the centuries of its transmission, patient, undiminished by the distance it had traveled, asking the question it had always asked, "What do you wish to hear? What do you wish to see?" The question is not rhetorical. It is not the opening of a lecture or the announcement of a curriculum. It is a genuine question asked to a genuine seeker, requiring a genuine answer, which means requiring a moment of real attention, which means requiring the seeker to sit still for a moment and locate, somewhere beneath the noise of the day's preoccupations, what is actually being asked for. The figure waits. It has always waited. That is perhaps the most consistent thing about it across every tradition in which it appears. The patience is absolute, because the figure is not waiting for a particular answer. It is waiting for the genuine one, however long that takes. The afternoon light in the library finally shifted. The horizontal gold of the late afternoon narrowed and fell, and the room went to a softer, more even gray. The scholar who had been reading rolled the text closed with careful hands. He held it for a moment, the way one holds something heavy that has unexpectedly turned out to be heavier than anticipated. He set it down. Outside, the harbor would be going on with its business. Ships, merchants, the ordinary machinery of the world. Inside, the room was very still, and the question the text had asked was still in the air, or felt as though it was unanswered, not because it could not be answered, but because the kind of answer it required was not a sentence, but a direction, a way of turning. The figure in the vision had not gone anywhere. It was, the text implied, present in every state of genuine attention, waiting for the attention itself, rather than for any particular content the attention might deliver. Somewhere in Athens, a long time earlier, Socrates had stopped a man in the morning. Somewhere in the Norse cold, a chieftain had set food before a traveler, without knowing who it was. Somewhere in the mountain pass, the old man on the ox had paused, and perhaps looked back once before the path turned. Somewhere in a monastery cell, The elder had listened until he could hear what was actually being asked, all of them in their own landscape and their own century, all of them performing in the way a craftsperson performs a long-practiced gesture, the same quiet act, pointing beyond themselves toward the question the other person was not yet capable of fully asking, and waiting with the specific patience of something that has understood the shape of time better than the person in front of it. The gesture had never stopped. That is what became visible from the height at which all of them could be seen at once. Not a procession, not a lineage, not a tradition consciously handing itself from hand to hand across the centuries. Something that did not require a chain of transmission because it was not outside the persons in whom it appeared, but structured into the territory of interiority itself, available wherever a human being had been brought to the edge of their own knowing and had found, there at the edge, something that looked back with patience. The horizontal light was gone now from the Alexandrian library. The room was still. The text lay closed on the reading table, its question folded back inside it, available whenever the scroll was unrolled again, by this reader or by another one, centuries from now, who would not know this afternoon had happened. The question would be the same question. The figure in the opening vision would look up from the text with the same quality of attentive waiting it had always had. In every room where these words had been read aloud, in every century since the first hand set them down. What do you wish to hear? What do you wish to see? The lamp in the room burned lower. The library held its silence, and the gesture continued, as it always had, in the dark beyond the text, patient as stone, old as the mountains, still pointing. On the morning of November 12th, 1913, Jung sat at his desk at Kusnacht as the light came slowly into the room and resolved to go down. He had prepared for this the previous evening, not in the way one prepares for an experiment, with instruments, with a hypothesis, with a controlled method for measuring results. He had prepared the way a person prepares to enter water in the dark, by sitting for a long time with the intention, until the intention became steady. What he had decided was this, that he would descend deliberately into whatever the unconscious held, that he would not turn away from what arrived, and that he would record what he found with the same careful attention he gave to everything else. He later described the experience as lowering himself feet first into the earth, feeling for ground that was not immediately there, and continuing down anyway, past the point where he knew where he was. The first images came slowly, a figure on a slope, a narrow passage, darkness that was not empty. What he encountered in the days and weeks that followed did not feel, to him, like the contents of his own mind. This is the detail that remained important for the rest of his life. Not that the images were strange, though they were. Not that they were disturbing, though some were. What stayed with him was the quality of otherness they carried, the sense that something was generating them, that was not, or not entirely, the person doing the looking. He was not a man given to mystical inflation. He was a trained physician and a careful empiricist who had spent years reading the clinical literature of abnormal psychology. When he used the word other, he meant it precisely, and he knew how much depended on using it carefully. This is where the question of the dreaming mind becomes genuinely philosophical rather than merely psychological. Jung's understanding of dreams did not begin where Freud's had ended. It departed from a different premise entirely, which was this: the dreaming psyche does not primarily conceal, it completes. Where the waking mind has been selective, simplified, or just honestly insufficient, the dream restores what was missing, presents what was avoided, and offers what the ego alone could not reach. The dream, in this account, is not a code to be broken. It is a correction, a kind of intelligence that runs alongside ordinary thinking and tends to see more of the situation than the part of the mind that is tasked with managing daily life can afford to see. It is patient in the way that something is patient when it is not in a hurry, because it has all night and tomorrow night and the night after that, and will keep returning to the same territory until what it is carrying is finally received. The sleeping mind on this account is not less mind than the waking one. It is differently oriented mind. It faces a different direction. What Freud had seen in dreams was the pressure of what had been kept out, the wish that could not be admitted, the memory that was too uncomfortable to remain in daylight. This was a real observation, and an important one. Jung held it alongside a different observation, which was that some of what dreams contained could not be explained as suppressed personal material at all. The imagery was too old, the figures were too consistent. The patterns appeared in patients who had no conceivable access to the mythological structures they were generating in their sleep, and who often had no idea the structures even existed until they were shown, after the fact, a volume of comparative mythology, and found their dream within it, essentially intact, in a tradition they had never encountered. He had watched this enough times that he could not dismiss it as coincidence, and he was not a person who dismissed things he had watched enough times. The method he developed for working with these figures, not only in clinical work, but in his own interior life, in the long evenings at Kubnacht after the patients had gone, was one he called active imagination. The name is worth holding for a moment before moving past it, because it carries within it the central tension of the practice. The imagination is active. It is not passive, not receptive, in the sense of empty, not a blank surface onto which the unconscious projects while the practitioner watches uninvolved. The imagination is brought to the encounter as a participant, as a voice, as a presence that responds. And yet it is also, and this is the part that required everything from him, it is also still enough to let something arrive that did not originate in the deliberate part of the mind. The practice holds both of these simultaneously, which is why it is not easy, and why he never suggested it was. The instruction, if it can be given as briefly as this, is something like, enter a state of quiet, open attention, let the interior space become present to itself. When a figure arrives, and he found that they did arrive, reliably, given patience, do not analyze it, speak to it, ask it what it has to say, write down what it answers, not in the voice of the person asking, but in whatever voice replies. Then bring yourself, your actual perspective, your actual disagreement, or confusion, or curiosity, back into the dialogue. Continue until something has been genuinely said between two parties, neither of which is entirely the other. This sounds simple. It is not. The difficulty is that the ordinary mind, the planning, evaluating, self-monitoring mind, does not quiet easily. It wants to know in advance what the figure will say. It wants to narrate the dialogue rather than participate in it. It wants to conclude before the other voice is finished. Learning to hold that tendency in check, to keep the space genuinely open, is the work of a long time, and Jung was the first to acknowledge that he spent considerable portions of it failing. But the figure of Philemon did not wait for the practice to be perfected. Philemon arrived in a waking vision, not a dream, or not only a dream, with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull, moving across the interior landscape with the ease of something that had been there far longer than the person observing it. He was an old man. He walked with a slight irregularity in his step, a quality that seemed almost deliberate, as though unevenness were part of how he moved through the world, rather than an impairment of it. He spoke, and what he said, Jung later wrote, seemed to come from somewhere that was not himself, not in the sense of a supernatural transmission, which was not a category Jung accepted without enormous qualification, but in a more verifiable and in some ways stranger sense. The thoughts that came through the figure of Philemon were thoughts that Jung had not thought. They were formulated in ways he could not account for. They arrived with a quality of authority that did not feel appropriated, but earned, though he could not say where the earning had taken place. He painted the figure. The image still exists in the pages of the book he was filling during those years, a large folio volume of calligraphic text and elaborate symbolic imagery that he worked on in the evenings by lamplight, returning to it across nearly 2 decades, and that no one else in the world would see for almost a century. The pages have a quality of total attention, every symbol placed with care, every color chosen, every proportion deliberate, not the work of someone who was documenting an experience from outside it, the work of someone living inside it and recording it from within. He walked with Philemon in the garden at Kusnacht. This is the detail that can seem strange to encounter, and yet is not, when held alongside what Jung understood about the nature of inner figures, that they are not merely representations, not merely recalled images, but presences with their own consistency, their own characteristic manner, their own things to say that do not change according to the observer's preference. The garden was real. The walking was real. The sense of someone beside him, moving at his own pace, speaking when there was something to say, silent when there was not. This was real enough that Jung credited Philemon with a quality of wisdom he was careful not to appropriate as his own. He said Philemon taught him something. He meant this precisely, that there was an intelligence available in that encounter that was not merely the reflection of what he already knew. What does it mean for a mind to encounter something within itself that seems wiser than itself? This is not a question with a simple answer, and Jung did not pretend it was. He spent years working out the vocabulary needed even to ask it carefully, the distinction between the ego and the self, between the personal voice and the transpersonal pattern, between the image as private memory and the image as participation in something that long preceded any individual life. None of this vocabulary felt adequate to him, even as he developed it. He kept returning to the lived experience, to the quality of what had actually occurred in those encounters, because the experience seemed to him to be more reliable than any concept he could build around it. The compensatory intelligence of the dream, the sense that the sleeping mind is presenting what the waking one could not reach, has a particular quality when it arrives through a recurring figure rather than a single dream event. Jung distinguished carefully between dream images that appear once and carry the quality of ordinary narrative, and figures that recur across multiple dreams with a consistent character, a consistent manner of presence, a consistent atmosphere that the dreamer recognizes before any content has been exchanged. These recurring figures in his account are not inventions. They are presences with a degree of autonomy that ordinary psychological language has difficulty holding without either inflating it into the supernatural or reducing it to something that drains away what is actually interesting about the phenomenon. The wise old man arrives in this way, not announced, not explained. He is simply there, at the edge of something, a forest, a road, a room, a landscape that is not quite any of these, and the dreamer who encounters him tends to know, before a word is spoken, that something of significance is present. The knowledge is not intellectual. It is a quality of the air around the figure, something in how the scene arranges itself in his vicinity, something that the waking mind has no better word for than presence, even though presence is not a precise term, for anything and everyone who uses it knows this. What the figure carries when he arrives in this way is not information in the ordinary sense of that word. He is not a delivery mechanism for facts the dreamer lacks. What he carries is something more like perspective, a quality of seeing that takes in more of the situation than the dreamer alone has been able to take in, and that does not communicate what it sees through explanation, but through its manner of regarding things. The look of someone who has been sitting with a question long enough that the urgency has drained from it, and only the question remains, patient and clear. The ease of someone for whom difficulty is not an emergency. The kind of attention that allows things to be what they are, rather than requiring them to be different. These are qualities that the dreaming psyche, in Jung's understanding, generates not arbitrarily, but in response to what the conscious life has been missing. The archetype is constellated, drawn into activity by a real gap. Something in the waking situation requires what only this kind of figure embodies. A decision has reached the limit of what calculation can resolve. A grief has outrun the consolations that ordinary thinking offers. A question has arrived that requires not an answer, but a different kind of mind from which to hold the question, and the dreaming psyche, because it has access to patterns far older than the individual life, reaches for the one it has always had available. The mandala that appears in the drawings of patients during periods of fragmentation and inner upheaval points toward the same source. Jung had watched this often enough that it ceased to surprise him, though it never ceased to interest him. The emergence under conditions of psychological stress or transformation of circular images with radial symmetry, images that appeared in cultures with no contact with one another, in traditions separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles. The Tibetan monk working grain by grain in colored sand over many days, placing the directions, marking the center, filling the pattern with care that has no impatience in it. The Gothic rose window in the stone face of a cathedral, the light through it falling in concentric rings on the floor within. A patient sitting in a Zurich consulting room, drawing small, careful circles in the margins of a notebook without knowing why, the pencil moving with the same steadiness as the monk's fingers over the sand. Jung had drawn them himself, in the early years of his descent, before the vocabulary had formed around the experience, before he knew what he was doing in any theoretical sense. He had drawn small circular images in his notebook, concentric rings, a faint emerging symmetry, and had found that drawing them restored something that the preceding hours of difficult interior work had disturbed. He did not know, when he was doing it, that he was generating the same form that the Tibetan tradition and the Gothic builders and the sand painters of the American Southwest had each generated, each in their own language. He found this out afterward, and what it meant to him was not that all of these traditions had been pointing towards something he had now discovered, but something quieter than that, that the form toward which his own psyche had reached in a moment of need was a form the human psyche had reached for, independently and repeatedly, across so much of its recorded history, that the reaching itself seemed to be part of what the psyche was. This is the ground from which amplification operates, the method by which a dream image is understood, not by departing from it in the direction of personal association, but by staying close to it and placing it within the full range of contexts in which analogous images have appeared. The image in the dream is not a disguise. It is not encoding a biographical memory in symbolic language. It is a node in a web of human meaning that extends far beyond any individual life, and the work of amplification is to illuminate that web by drawing in the threads that run toward the image from many directions. The medieval alchemist who wrote of a wise old man appearing in a vision at the beginning of the work. The fairy tale collected in the German countryside, in which an old man at the side of the road gives the hero a small object that seems worthless and proves essential. The Norse account of a wanderer who arrives at a hall and knows the name of every person within it before he has been introduced to any of them. Each of these threads, followed carefully toward the dream image at the center, adds to the image's weight without determining its meaning, leaves it more resonant, more charged, more capable of returning something to the dreamer who began with it. The dreamer who began with it, in the end, is always someone specific, in a specific life, at a specific moment, that has brought them to a threshold their ordinary resources cannot carry them past. This is what is easy to lose sight of when the discussion becomes sufficiently large in its frames of reference, sufficiently cross-cultural in its sweep. The archetype is a general form. The encounter with it is always singular. The old man who appears in the dream appears to this person in this night within this particular configuration of what has been lived and what has not yet been understood about it. He may carry patterns that are older than any culture. What he says, if he says anything, is said here now, to this one. Active imagination returns the question to this singularity. The practice begins with the general availability of the figure and narrows toward the specific encounter, this person sitting in this room with eyes closed and the day's thinking quieted, watching the interior space attend to itself. The figure, when it arrives as it has always arrived, not summoned, not constructed, but present, standing at the edge of wherever the inner landscape extends, waiting with a patience that does not feel like waiting because it has no urgency about it. Simply there, in the way a mountain is there, present before you look at it and present after you stop. The first impulse for most people is to manage this, to begin interpreting rather than encountering, to name what is seen before the seeing is complete, to turn the figure into a concept before it has had a chance to be a presence. This is the ordinary mind doing what it does when it encounters something it cannot immediately place, reaching for a category, reaching for a prior explanation, preferring the familiarity of an idea to the slight discomfort of something genuinely other. Jung's instruction, insofar as it was an instruction, was to resist this, to let the figure stand as it is, to speak to it rather than about it, to listen with the particular quality of listening that expects to be surprised. What arrives in that quality of listening tends to be surprising, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality of a revelation that announces itself as such. The surprise tends to be quieter than that, a reframing of a situation the dreamer thought they already understood, a question offered in return for the one the dreamer asked, a perspective on something familiar that makes the familiar look subtly different, the way light changes the color of a landscape without changing its shape. The figure does not explain, he does not prophesy, he asks or he points, or he is simply present in a way that clarifies something the dreamer's thinking had been circling around without landing on. And then, in the logic of the interior encounter, he goes, this is not abandonment. It is the manner of the archetype's operation, which has always been to pass through rather than to stay, to confer something that remains when the figure itself is gone, to leave a capacity rather than an answer. The crossroads without the old man who appeared there is not empty. Something happened there. The traveler who walked away from it carried something that could not have been named before the encounter, and did not need to be named afterward, because it was not a piece of knowledge, but a quality of orientation, a slight adjustment to the angle from which the road ahead was being regarded. What Jung called individuation, the long, non-linear process by which the psyche moves toward a fuller realization of its own particular wholeness, is not a destination that is reached. It is not a state that is finally arrived at and then maintained. It is a direction, and the figures of the inner world are, among other things, orientations, presences that restore or reveal a direction when the ordinary life of plans and habits and self-understanding has lost track of it. The wise old man, in this context, is not a teacher who finishes the curriculum and sends the student away complete. He is something more like a weather pattern that recurs when the psychic atmosphere requires it, present when the conditions call for him, absent when they do not, returning without warning and without explanation, reliable in the way that seasons are reliable, which is not reliably predictable, but reliably recurrent. The dream that is not remembered in words, but held in the body as a quality of having been addressed, is closer to this than any dream that arrives neatly packaged in narrative. The dreamer wakes from it, knowing something happened. There is a residue, not information, not a story, but a feeling of having been in the presence of something that regarded them with attention and without judgment, the way very old things tend to regard the things that have not yet had time to be old. The lamp on the table in the dark room, the window with a pale gray beginning in it, the slow return of the room's particulars as the interior landscape recedes. For a moment between the dream and the day, both are simultaneously present. This is the state that active imagination tries to extend and work within, the permeability of that threshold, the openness that is available when the ordinary organizing intelligence has not yet fully reasserted itself, and the material from the other side of sleep is still close enough to engage with directly. Jung worked there often, by choice and by practice, returning in the early hours to the figures he had met in sleep, extending the encounter past the point where the dream had ended, allowing it to continue in the waking imagination with the same quality of receptivity that the dream had held. He was not performing this. He was not, by his own account, particularly comfortable with what it required of him, which was a sustained willingness to be in the presence of something he could not fully account for, could not reduce to a prior category, could not manage into familiarity. He was a careful man, intellectually cautious, professionally trained in skepticism. What he trusted was the observation, not the explanation, the repeated empirical fact of these encounters, their consistency, their internal logic, their independence from his wishes about what they would contain. He trusted them the way a naturalist trusts the behavior of an animal that does not care whether it is being observed or not by believing anything about it in advance, but by watching long enough and honestly enough that the behavior begins to show its pattern, the pattern that emerged across decades of observation, his own and his patient's, was not a single pattern, but a cluster of related ones. The old man arriving when the ordinary mind has exhausted itself, the question asked rather than the answer given, the pointing beyond, the gesture towards something the figure will not itself carry across the threshold, the departure that leaves something behind, the return in a different form when the same kind of threshold arrives. Across this pattern, once it was visible, the traditions he had spent years reading began to speak more plainly, not because they contained the pattern's explanation, but because they were also records of its observation, gathered from different distances, in different languages, under different names, by people who had watched long enough and honestly enough to see what was reliably there. There is a certain quality of attention that the old figures in these traditions share. The barefoot philosopher who had lived with a question long enough that he carried it easily. The hermit in the mountain pass, who had given up the urgent management of things and arrived somewhere quieter than urgency. The elder in the monastery, sitting across from the young man who had walked 3 days with a question, saying nothing for a long time, and then answering not the question that was asked, but the one the young man had not yet found the language for. All of them characterized by this, that the quality of their attention was the content of what they offered. That wisdom, in their embodiment of it, was not separate from the way they regarded things, but continuous with it. That to be in their presence was itself the instruction. The inner figure carries this in the way that inner figures can, not through a performance of wisdom, but through a quality of presence that is felt before anything is said, and that remains when the saying is done. It is the particular calm of something that has been in relation to very large and very old things for a long time, not the calm of someone who does not feel the difficulty of the situation, but the calm of someone who can hold the difficulty without being reorganized by it. The difference is perceptible. The dreamer who wakes from an encounter with this figure tends to know which kind it was, even if they cannot say how they know. In Kusnacht, in the garden that ran along the shore of the lake, Jung walked in the evenings after the clinical work was done, and felt, by his own account, the presence of Philemon beside him, not at every step, not as a continuous apparition, but as a quality of companionship that the garden held, the sense of an intelligence moving at his own pace through the same space, occasionally saying something, more often simply present. The old man with the lame foot and the kingfisher's wings, folded now, no longer strange, simply the manner of this particular presence in this particular garden in the later part of a day that had been long and full of other people's difficulty. They walked without urgency. The water was near, always. At Kusnacht, the water and the light had the quality that lake light has at that hour, diffuse and without strong shadow, holding the day in a medium that neither ends it nor prolongs it, but simply holds it in the quality of itself. The lamp in the house behind the trees was already lit. The study where the large folio volume waited with its unfinished pages, its calligraphic text, its painted symbols that were still accumulating towards something that would not be complete for many more years. All of that was behind. The garden was forward, and the presence beside him in the garden, moving with that slight irregularity that was simply how this figure moved, unhurried, undemanding, entirely at ease within the evening. What Philemon carried in those evening walks was not the kind of wisdom that speaks in propositions. It was not a body of knowledge that could be extracted and filed and consulted when the relevant problem arose. What it was, if it can be said at all, was a quality of orientation toward the depth of things, the capacity to remain in relation to what is larger and older than the individual life without being annihilated by the relation, the capacity to encounter something that exceeds the ego's management and respond to it, not with defense, but with curiosity. Not because the difficulty has been removed, but because the frame within which the difficulty sits has become large enough to hold it without emergency. This is what Jung found available in the practice he had developed through those years of descent and return. Not safety, exactly, though there was something in it that was stabilizing in the way that deep groundwater is stabilizing to the landscape above it, not visible, not encountered directly, but present as a kind of support that does not fail when the surface conditions shift. What he found was company of a particular kind, not company that agrees or reassures or provides the comfort of simple confirmation, but company that is genuinely other, genuinely present, and genuinely wise, in a way that the ordinary social life of confirmation and consensus cannot quite replicate. The practice he developed and the theoretical architecture he built around it were both attempts to make available to others what had become available to him in that descent, not the particular content of his encounters, which were his, but the method, the orientation, the understanding of what the interior contains, and how to approach it with appropriate respect. The dream taken seriously, the recurring figure met with genuine attention, the image followed closely rather than departed from too quickly, the encounter maintained long enough to hear what is actually being said rather than what was expected. Late in his life, Jung said that the meaning of his work, the long arc of it, from the early clinical years through the theoretical elaborations, through the cultural and historical amplifications, was to demonstrate that the psyche is not a problem to be managed, but a reality to be lived with, that the figures it generates are not symptoms to be decoded, but presences to be encountered, that the intelligence available in the interior life, if it is approached with the patience and seriousness that any genuine intelligence deserves, has things to say that the ordinary waking mind alone cannot say to itself. The old man in the garden at Kusnacht goes on walking. His foot falls with its slight irregularity on the path, the sound of it continuous with the sound of the water nearby, neither louder nor softer than what surrounds it, simply present within the evening's texture of sound and light and the cool coming in from the lake. The wings are folded. He is not going anywhere in particular, or he is already where he is going, which amounts to the same thing at this pace and in this light. The lamp in the study burns steadily behind the trees, the painted pages inside it waiting without impatience, the figures on them fixed in their own authority, the old man among them with his kingfisher wings spread wide across the vellum, the color still bright across all the years, the ink still black, still legible, still saying what it was painted to say. The garden holds the walking, and the sound of it. The lake holds the garden. The dark beyond the lamp is full and still and does not press against anything, only rests where it has always been, patient in the way that darkness is always patient, which is completely and without needing to be told that the light will come again.